If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Today I'm going to talk about a pretty common feeling around our work and our productivity. And this feeling is, why do I feel like I didn't get anything done? I think we've all experienced this feeling. We get home or whatever it is we do in the current work from home culture, and our significant other asks some form of, how was your day? And sometimes we just say fine and move on. But once in a while, we get introspective and we think, how was my day? How did I do today? How was my output today? And at this point, we try to think of something to report, something that seems interesting or meaningful about the last 8-10 hours of our lives. And we look back and we struggle to find something. We know we were working all day. We know we were at our computer or in our office or whatever that looks like. And we know that we were working all day. And we also know that we went to the coffee pot or the restroom or had a conversation about the football game with a coworker, but we know we were there all day and we were working all day. But what did we actually do? Did we produce something of value, something tangible, or some result in the world? And can we find that? Or do we just, kind of sigh and move along with this sense of, well, it's another day on the treadmill and my job is just not that kind of job? And that's a problem, because this is a bad place to be from the standpoint of motivation and from the standpoint of engagement. So I'm going to talk about this feeling. I'm going to talk a little bit about things that I think cause it, and talk about then some things that we can do to address it, hopefully. And I believe that there's something that we can do about it, and I think there are some actionable steps we can take. So I'm going to talk about that in this episode today. So first, before I get to that, I would like to let's deal with the most common idea I see, the most common productivity tip that I see around this. And that tip is, pick one or X. Pick one or three or whatever a different person's number might be. Things to do today that you feel like are really going to move the needle. And put those at the highest priority of your list. And if you can get those done, then you'll feel like you had a productive day. And I think that's fine if you can do it. I think there are challenges to that, in the sense of, I come to this day with a calendar that is not empty. I come to this day with an email box full of stuff. I come to this day with, bringing these things along from past days. And so when I look at that and I go, okay, well, can I pick one thing and get it done? Yeah, maybe. The balance of things that move the needle versus things I can accomplish in the time I have available today, there may not be a ton of overlap in that. And we'll talk about a little bit more about what that means as we go forward. And I'm not saying that pick some number of things to get done today is not a fine idea. It's a fine idea. I think it would have been better to have picked some number of things that were going to get done today and pick them 2 days ago. And then you can plan and structure the rest of your day around getting those things done. And we'll talk about what all this looks like. The other thing that I'll say is I think there's such a thing as a completion mindset. I think there are habits of thought that lead to habits of work that put us in a position where we actually complete things. And we'll talk about what that is. And I think if we can get there, if we can get to the point where we're completing things, then I think this feeling will go away. I think at the end of the day, at least we'll be able to say, well, I didn't get everything done, but I got that done. That thing is off my plate and it's moved on down the road. And if we can begin to say things like that at the end of our day, then that's going to lead to this cumulative sense of progress. Because I think the negative part of the feeling is I put in X hours today and my task list tomorrow is going to look substantially like my task list today looked. In other words, the work, the things that I want to get done, the things that I need to get done are constantly ahead of me. And we look at that and we go, well, that's just miserable. That's pushing the rock up the hill. The Greek or Roman or maybe both legend of Sisyphus, whose punishment for the life he lived was he rolled a rock up the hill every day. And then the next day, the rock would be at the bottom of the hill again. And they had to push it back up the hill. And so we all have different metaphors for this. But if we can't complete things, if we can't point to something and say, that thing is done, then we get into this mindset of, I'm pushing the rock today. And I've pushed the rock for the last 12 work days running, and that's just my lot in life, is to push the rock. And then that's when we get into sort of a challenge of motivation and a challenge of having a sense of value in our work. As we look deeper into this situation, I think that there are two basic kinds of complaints when we say, I didn't get anything done today. I think one category is, I didn't do anything but email today. In other words, I didn't do anything important. I did other people's stuff all day long, and there was no time for me to get my stuff done. So I think that's one version of the complaint. And the other is, I didn't move the needle. I worked on things, but I don't see a result. And we'll get to that one in a minute. But the first one is I didn't get to any important tasks today. I didn't have time to get to any important tasks today. And that's, again, when we've spent the day responding to other people, and we've spent the day in email, and we've spent the day potentially in meetings. Meetings are a special class, and I think meetings count as important work, but that's another podcast. And most people would say, well, I didn't do anything but meetings and emails today. Well, there are some classes of jobs where meetings are your work. And again, that's another podcast. But what's going on here is that in the modern workplace, email has become a work assignment tool. And if you think about it carefully, I think you'll agree with this, because your email account is full of these questions and these requests from other people. And those requests help the other people move their stuff along. But it's a very bad work assignment tool. because there's very little visibility into what your backlog is in these email, and I'll say in these work assignments from your email. And people going, well, I can't move my thing along until I get this piece of information, and Susie won't answer my emails, so I'm going to kick it up to you, and maybe you can help me or get Susie or whatever. Right? These kinds of work that get transmitted through email. And I don't think anybody's a bad actor here. I think it's just habits that we've built up. And we can get into that, but that's another episode as well. So this is a sort of a challenging issue. And so I'm trying to distill it down and get us to focus on the one area that I want to deal with here. And as email has become a work assignment tool, then the expectation has become that you will do what's in your email. And that's, people say that without really realizing that it is a work assignment tool. Oh, it's just a couple of questions from people. How long could it take? Well, when I was working in this team environment, it was pretty easy for somebody to send me an email that took them 45 seconds to write that's going to take me 45 minutes to answer. And that's one of the challenges. And we've talked about asynchronous communication. That's one of the challenges. And it's just true of the world. When I was going through Ph.D. school, I had a quote that I used a lot. And the quote was, examinations are to be feared even by the best prepared, the most well prepared, because the greatest fool can ask more than the wisest man can answer. Now, phrasing it that way, and I don't mean that the people that were asking me questions were fools or the people that are giving me exams are fools, but it is true. Why is the sky blue? Well, I don't know. And I could probably research it and explain it, but at the end of the day, I don't know. If you need to do some research to get your job moving along, then you do research to get your job moving along. But I'm not your research assistant, right? And so the point is that email is kind of a small case of that. It's not that you can't answer the question. It's that, it's simple. Think about it. How many times have you gotten a 2-line email from a teammate and spent 30 or 45 minutes writing out an answer? And when you look at it that way, then it becomes this work that we're doing. And so, the challenge here is to actually deal with email as email and to recognize that you're getting work assignments from people who probably don't have the authority to assign work to you, and to think about it from that perspective. And I don't mean be a bad teammate. You've got to be helpful and you've got to be collegial and you got to be a good teammate, but really take a critical look at this and go, I just don't see this as being part of what I'm going to accomplish today. And then you get the opportunity to start learning how to say no. And I think that's a phrase that gets trampled on a lot. And the emphasis for me is on learning to say no. There are appropriate ways to say no. And while you don't want to spend, 15 minutes saying something that could take 5 seconds to say, learning how to say no is learning what to say no to, learning phrasing, learning, to help, I guess, other people understand to some degree why you're saying no. And I hear a lot of advice about, well, no is a complete sentence. And I agree with that. But we are still social creatures and we still have to, acknowledge the relationship and acknowledge that we're supposed to be helping each other, and at the same time to push back a little bit when somebody assigns us work via email. You got to think about the fact that not everybody that can send you an email is a customer of yours. The number of people who can send you an email is a large number, and none of us can deal with an infinite number of customers. It's really hard to set up a system to deal with large numbers of customers, and email ain't it. And so, sometimes it's just, I love you and I want to help you, but you got to do your own work, buddy. and maybe it's a conversation outside of just the email. Maybe it's a conversation with somebody who habitually sends you these emails, and you take them to lunch or buy them a cup of coffee, and you sit them down and you say, okay, well, here's the thing, right? You're sending me a lot of emails and I want to be helpful, but I got to get my own work done. What do we do about this, right? And so move that conversation along. But when we talk about learning to say no, it's a learned skill, and it's situational and it's environmental, so it's complicated. But you've got to experiment with it rather than just saying, well, they'll get mad. Okay. Well, people that get mad get unmad. And so, if you say no the wrong way and it makes somebody mad, then go and apologize to them. But, learn how to say it, practice how to say it, pick something that's a clear example, and just get your courage going and just find a way to say within the relationship and with good motives, just no, I don't have time to do that for you. And there's other discussions about how to build this skill, so I'll leave that there for now. The other one I think is maybe a little more challenging, the other kind of complaint. So we said there were two. One is I didn't do anything but email today. And then we talked about how to sort of tame the email beast. The other is those days when we didn't have a ton of emails, but we look back at our stuff and we go, what was my output? And so that one is also quite interesting. And I think there's some mindset things that we can do here. First, though, I want to talk about the fact that knowledge work is not very tangible. And intangible often has the result of being hard to quantify. And really, that's the challenge and the nature of our work. And there are several examples, but first, let's contrast knowledge work, which most of us are engaged in, with physical product work. Okay. So if you're in the physical product world, you're dealing with tangible things. And that very tangibility makes progress visible, easily visible. So, if you build tables for a living and your task is to build 3 tables this week, well, Monday, you put wood on a lathe and build 12 table legs. Is the table finished? No, the table is not finished. But you can point to something, to a component of the table in the world and say, yes, but that part's done and it'll never have to be done again. Those 12 legs will never have to be turned again on a lathe. And everybody can agree with that. Now, does that mean that 12 is sufficient? No, it doesn't. 12 may be great, 12 may be not enough. That's really not the point. The point is you can point to something and go, well, I did that. And mentally, that's very different. In our own brains, that's very different from the way that we typically approach knowledge work. So the lesson that we take away from physical work is we need to try to make our product tangible. We need to try to bring pieces of it out such that we can complete those pieces and have something to point to. So if you're writing a 65,000 page book manuscript, how do you measure progress? How do you make it quantifiable? And the way to do that is to break it up into chunks and say, well, no, the book is not done. Yes, chapter 1 is done. And there's a mindset around this that we're taught that I think is failing us. And we'll get into that. But defining your task well, and this notion of creating a definition of done. Definition of done is a term from Agile Scrum methodology, where you sit down and think about what done looks like. And in that calculation is some thinking about what's a reasonable result given the constraints. So you sit down and you think about this. And I think that is something that is not taught to us. It's a skill that we have to learn. And in fact, I think what most of us learn to do in school and the habits that we build around our schoolwork really are the opposite. So if we think about the way we learn to do things in school, okay, we understand two things really about schoolwork. And by schoolwork, I'm thinking about, building these reports. I'm thinking about this intangible stuff. I'm thinking about, we'll study for an exam, right? So there are many features, but two that I think are really important here. One is an A is the only acceptable result. And I've talked to parents and I've talked to students, and different people say different things, but in American culture, at the end of the day, the only real rewarding result is an A. B's are not, B's are always like, I mean, as I record this, we're watching the Olympics, and the silver medal is a huge achievement, but we look at the silver medalist and we go, oh, and that's just our mindset, right? So that may be something that we can deal with or not. But there's a result of that that's really important. We'll get to that. The other thing that we learn to do in school is we learn to take available time and move the project along. We're not taught, and I think this is in part because of the circumstances of the work that we're doing. We're not taught to break it down into chunks and deal with it. We're not taught that, oh, I've studied chapter 1 of the textbook. I'm finished with studying chapter 1 of the textbook. I don't know of a metric that allows anybody to say, I'm finished with it. I'm finished studying it. Maybe if you're the kind of person who can do these huge memory tricks and you can recite chapter 1 verbatim, maybe you could say, well, I'm done with that one. But the nature of the task there is such that we really struggle to create a definition of done. And it's because, in part, because of this standard of A is the only really acceptable grade. And there's lots of bits and pieces to that, but just as an example of kind of how we develop work habits in school, and we're looking at these tasks, and it's like, that's how we learn to do work and how we learn to complete things. So we're talking about creating a better definition of done. And my claim is that we're not taught how to do this in our work training, which is school. So this notion of creating a better definition of done as we look at our work. And I'll say here that we're all engaged in a best effort kind of situation. We don't like to acknowledge it, and our customers certainly don't want to acknowledge it, and our bosses generally don't want to acknowledge it. But we're all in a best effort situation because we have constraints. And our work is always of the nature that this is the best I could do given the constraints. Now, one constraint is time. Another constraint is our own skill level. And here's where a dose of humility comes in. I mean, you have a skill level around these tasks. One of the things that I commonly say to people, and particularly to my children, is, it's the first time you've ever done it. You're supposed to be bad at it. And we get into the workplace, and all of a sudden we start promoting ourselves as good at anything. And I believe that we can be good at anything. But that's very different from saying that you can be good at anything is very different from saying I am already good at everything. Those two things are very, very different, but they collide a lot in our language. And you are capable of becoming good, but that doesn't mean that you're already good. And so, really just this little dose of humility, I think, will help us. And we're in a best effort world, and we've got to acknowledge that. If you want a perfect report, great, give me 6 months to do it. Well, we don't have 6 months. Okay, then we're not going to get a perfect result. Can we agree on that? And then can we move this along? And this is not an excuse for sloppy. This is not an excuse for less than best effort. It's just a recognition of the realities of the world. And then the other piece is recognizing that done is better than perfect. A result in the world is better than no result in the world. And we'll talk about this a lot throughout this idea. And the mental picture, if you could resurrect Leonardo da Vinci and you show him the Mona Lisa, in his deepest heart of hearts, do you think he would see something that he might change? Do you think he would, oh no, it's perfect? I doubt it. He would look at the painting and go, well, come to think of it, that smile is a little bit more mysterious than I intended it to be. Somebody give me a paintbrush real quick. And so, this notion of best effort, this notion of done is better than perfect. But it does take some humility. And the larger point that I'm trying to make here is we're not great at defining the result of knowledge work. We're not great at defining what the task is, particularly around the area of quality. And again, we're taught this in school. We're not given a grading rubric because the teachers don't want to be tied down to that. And I've taught at college level, and rubrics are really, really hard to come up with. The only real way to do a rubric is to do it after the fact and tell everybody, okay, here's the things y'all generally did wrong, and here's how I graded them. Because you can create a rubric all day long, but then your students are going to surprise you with the things that they do. And then if you try and apply the rubric, then it's really difficult. And at the end of the day, you know, we do the best we can. And when we look at it from that perspective, and again, don't lose the bigger picture. We're talking about this notion of, well, I didn't make any progress on the important stuff. I worked on it, but I didn't make any progress on it. Okay. That's why we're getting to this definition of done. And I think one of the biggest challenges to our definition of done is this intangible quality thing that is just true of our work. So we do need to do the work involved to say, hey, this constitutes done. Now, the shortcut here, and we'll get to this in a minute, the shortcut here is to just acknowledge the constraint and deal with it. In other words, if you've only got 2 hours to produce the report, then that becomes a part of your definition of done. When we don't define what done is, when we don't create this better definition of done, we wind up with well, I'll move it along. And here I'm going to talk about this reasonably complex notion of the salience of incomplete tasks. Well, that was a mouthful. So salience is the notion of how readily something brings itself to your mind. Something is said to be salient if it's something that's easily remembered or easily attended to within our brains. And it's been demonstrated time and time again that incomplete tasks are more salient than complete tasks. Now, I also make the argument that incomplete tasks are in their most complex state, right? And I've talked about that on other episodes. But the salience of incomplete tasks is huge in our brains. And a lot of times when we think about this definition of done, and we don't create a good, crisp definition of done, then we just fall back to, well, I'll move it along. I'll spend a couple hours on it and move it along. So invariably, that leads us into the notion that the task is incomplete, and that's very salient in our minds. So it gets more focus maybe than it ought to when we're thinking about the things that we do. And I'll move it along. Accomplishment is a good bit more binary than that. Our sense of accomplishment is much more crisp. Well, I spent another 2 hours on the report. Doesn't ring the bell in our brains as complete. So it's salient. It's on our minds that this task is still incomplete. So again, an argument for this definition of done and for spending the time to do it. We want a definition of done that allows us to point to something that is different in the world, even if it's somewhat an intangible product. And by intangible here, I mean it's a non-physical product. And earlier I talked about, well, chapter 1 is done. And to have a definition of done that really allows you to be confident when you make that statement to yourself. Done means I'm not going to look at it again. Done in the physical world means if I put that table leg back on the lathe, it's not going to get any better. A done steak is one that can only get worse with more time in the oven. And to have that kind of mindset when we create our definition of done, that it's something that we'll be able to rest on and stand on, rather than this little tiny caveat in the back of our heads, well, I'll look at it again if I have more time. But your brain is looking for that in order to decrease this salience. When your brain thinks about a complete task, it's not going to be satisfied with, well, I worked on it for 2 hours. And that's this drudgery. So think about what has changed, what is different in the world. Think about moving it to a state where you can confidently to yourself say, it's done. I'm not going to touch it again. And put yourself in that position with your definition of done. Now, there's a challenge here because when we talk about creating this crisp definition of done, it's not simple. It's not a trivial task. It's not something that, oh, is going to take 3 seconds. And your brain is going to resist doing that work. And by doing that work, I don't mean doing the work itself, although that may be true. I mean creating the definition of done. Because we all want to get started. We're all in a hurry. We all want to get started, and creating a definition of done is hard work, and your brain's going to reject it, and you're going to go, well, let me just get started and I'll figure it out as I go along. And I think that hurts us from this bigger picture of, did we complete something? And having a crisp definition of done and feeling this sense of accomplishment is a sufficient reason to take time to plan your work. There's many benefits of planning your work, but to create this crisp definition of done is one of them. And so you're framing the task for yourself. You're giving yourself this idea of, well, I'm the expert. I say that's done given the constraints. Okay. It's always done given the constraints. And in the physical product world, we don't think about that as much because I think the constraints maybe are a little lower, or we accept them better in the physical product world. I don't know. But it's going to be a challenge to do this. The hustle culture is part of it. I don't have time to think about it. I just need to do it. And moving the next thing along. That's a challenge to this planning work, this definition of done work. And finally, we're challenged because we all know somewhere in the back of our heads that we're not really good at planning. This is an intangible thing. Maybe it's something we've never done before, or we've only done a few times, and we don't have any muscle memory on how to get it done. And so it seems like we're starting over from scratch again when we do this. To say I'm good at writing reports is not a great phrase. You may be a good writer, and that's great. You may have worked on your skills and other people have told you you're a good writer, and that's fine. But context matters. And I was a pretty good business writer, according to all the people who were willing to give me feedback on it. And then when I got to school, it was totally different. And now that I've been to school, I've learned how to write as an academic, and it's a struggle to learn again how to write as a non-academic. The point of that is that we struggle with planning, and we know we struggle with planning. And so it's hard to get our brains to do it. And so, again, motivation, I'm trying to help and encourage you to sit down and create a definition of done that acknowledges the constraints. And then within those constraints, do the work diligently, do it with focus within the constraints. And then that'll help us with this completion mindset. So the definition of done, and I've hit this pretty hard throughout the previous minutes of this talk, is this is what constitutes complete for me in these circumstances. And if you can say that, then your task is to do that thing. Did you do what you planned? Did you fulfill your definition of done? And then when you do that and you focus on that, you plan an amount of effort and you do that effort. then you can say, I did what I planned. Is it perfect? No, it's not. I know it's not perfect, but I did actually do best effort. So we followed our process. We've done what we intended to do. And now when I say do it, I mean plan an amount of effort and then do that effort and don't go back to it. Don't go back to completed work. Don't go back to work that is done by your definition. Only in very rare cases will you go back to it. But don't have this mindset of this provisional done. I'm done unless I have time to look at it again. That's not helpful because your brain knows what's going on there and it's still an incomplete task. So that's this notion of the completion mindset, is to define something that is completable and then complete that, perform to that plan. And that will give you a sense of accomplishment in the sense that, yes, I did this thing. And we're back to the table legs as an example. Are the tables complete? No, the tables are not complete. What is complete? Well, the legs are complete. Okay, I can feel good about it, right? The legs are done. Somebody else could pick it up and move it along for me. So that's this completion mindset. Now, we're talking about constraints and best effort here. So I will go back to the notion of completing one thing. And that's really sort of a challenge. If you don't add this completion mindset, going back to the complete one thing today is a challenge, because I think we need to acknowledge that your most important tasks are not completable in one day. So this is this notion of breaking things up into completable chunks. That's part of it, is to break it up into completable chunks and to keep track of those completable chunks. But you need to acknowledge that if something is truly important in your world, it's probably not something that's going to take one day. And as an example, I will give you some of the more important tasks in your world, and you can think about whether they're completable in any given period of time. Are your relationships completable? Well, no, not really. Can you define completable steps that move you in the direction of having the kind of relationship you want? Yes, you can. And to do those completable pieces with your best attention and your best focus, and then say, hey, I completed this thing. And then you can go back and you can judge it. And we'll talk about this in just a minute. But you can go back and you can judge it. Right? You yourself are challenged to judge an incomplete task. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So relationships are not completable really at all. Learning, getting better at what you do, is that a completable thing? Not really. And so just recognize that many of our most important things are not really completable at all. And so that's another motivation to define a chunk and get that chunk done. Another motivation to do this planning work, to do the work around a definition of done that makes sense to you and that you can be comfortable with given the constraints. So building a habit of thinking in completionist terms. I will say perfectionism is a big enemy in this battle that we're fighting. Perfectionism is the bugaboo. It's we think that our stuff can be perfect. It really is sort of some form of arrogance, I would say, in our lives to engage in perfectionism. We know good and well that our efforts are not perfect, but we somehow put out perfection as this notion. And people say, well, shoot for the moon, and then if you miss, you'll at least hit the stars. And there's wisdom to that. But perfectionism is a false target. So it's a big enemy here. And dealing with perfectionism is really another post. I think it has a lot to do with confidence and how do we build our confidence. But just recognize that that's going to be a problem, and have some humility about yourself and about your work, and just recognize that there are many constraints, and you and your current level of skill with the task is one of those constraints. And we talked about this earlier, so I won't beat it to death again. So what I'm advocating here is kind of a two-pronged approach around this. Defining completable tasks is really step one. And then I've mentioned this, but to allocate the time and spend it on the task. And when I say that, I mean really focus on time boxing. And there's some magic in time boxing. And one of the examples of that is I'll say, if you know that you've got to be done with the work in an hour, then realism creeps in and really addresses this notion of perfectionism. And we do it all the time. And it may disappoint us to some degree, but it's reality. I often will say, I'm quite disappointed in gravity, but it's there. Nothing I can do about it. So these constraints are actual constraints, and we're not superhuman here. But if we define a completable task, we allocate the time and spend it on the task, and push yourself to obey the constraint. If you allocate an hour to do some work, then push yourself to complete the work in an hour. And what you'll find yourself doing is you're more focused, you're more likely to do the kind of cleanup work, right? One easy trap to slip into is you say, well, I've got an hour and I'm going to work on this. And this is kind of the move it along mindset. You allocate an hour to it. And so you spend an hour writing prose in your manuscript task. But in that hour, you don't go back and grammar check what you wrote. Well, it's automatically not done. And you know it's not done. So if you time box and you honor the time box, then part of that is, well, if you've only got 60 minutes to do this thing, then you'd better spend the last 6 doing a stupid check on yourself, right? And you build that in, and that helps refine this sense of completion. Because if we spend an hour on it and don't do the grammar check, then we can't even claim to ourselves that it's complete, that we actually did something in this hour. So declare it done, right? Define what done is, allocate the time, and focus that time on the task. Push yourself to get it done in the time that you've allocated. And then at the end of that time period, declare it done and submit it. Move it along. If it's chapter 1, put chapter 1 away. Chapter 1 is finished. And we face these challenges because, and this is a little bit of recap, we face these challenges because other people are great at finding my mistakes. It's almost like they get a cookie for every mistake they find in my work. And at the end of the day, I'm not great at finding my own mistakes. And again, I'll go back to writing as a challenge. Proofreading your own stuff is a very challenging task. because you know what you intended to say. And it's easy to get into this mindset of reading and going, well, yeah, I meant to say blah, blah, blah. And that what you meant to say then overrides what you actually said. So I think it's a good idea. Again, it's a step of humility is to let other people go find your mistakes, but that's how we learn. And that's how we get better, is to have the courage to submit my stuff out into the world. This podcast is an example. If you have some feedback for me, I'd love to hear it. My email address is larry@dobusywrite.com. Send me a note. Tell me how all this lands with you. I'd love to hear it. But allow other people to be great at finding your mistakes. Right? Ideally, in this definition of done, you're completing the work soon enough so that somebody else can review it for you. And that gives you time to make any corrections to any real blunders rather than have your customer go, well, I've got to go with it because now I'm facing my own deadline. Another thought that I'll leave you with on this perfectionism. A mistake in a work doesn't remove 100% of the value of what you did. This done is better than perfect mindset. Does it have flaws? Does it have mistakes? Yes, it does. Is it still valuable? Yes, it is. Ask yourself, when other people are giving you work, right? Would you rather have a product that's finished with mistakes, or would you rather have a product that is unfinished and not delivered to you? And most of the time, it's the first one. We complain about the second one, but most of the time, it's the first one. Give me your stuff. Okay, we'll work it out. It'll be fine. And so give yourself that leeway and that credit as well. And the bottom line for all of this is be willing to be judged. Be willing to have other people help you get better. And fight this perfectionism. I think that we all think that we're better at things than we are. And I think it's because nobody's really told us. And that would be a gift to me, is tell me how I can get better. Now, whether I get better or not is on me, but feedback is a gift, and treat it as such and use it as an opportunity to recognize areas where you can actually improve. So be willing to be judged. So that's this two-pronged approach. Define completable tasks, allocate the time that you've planned, and spend it on the task. If you don't focus on the task during this time block, then you've just really given yourself no excuse for this feeling of I didn't finish. So what would be the result of all this hard work around definition of done? And to recap, really, that's what I'm arguing for, this completionist mindset. And a mindset that is, it's done. It's done to the best of my ability, given my constraints. Now, you don't want to dig into the constraints because all of a sudden that's excuse making. But given my current level of skill and the amount of effort that I was able to apply to this task, it's done. So and we've talked a lot about barriers to creating that definition of done, and we've talked about perfectionism, and we've talked about all these hurdles that we're going to have to get over in order to be able to create this definition of done. But at the end of the day, that's really what I'm arguing in favor of. If you learn and practice this completionist mindset, then you'll get the following results. The first is you'll build a habit of completing work. You'll build a process of completing work. And what that does is it builds confidence in yourself. It also builds an accurate picture for you of what your skill level is around this task and areas that you could put forth some effort and actually improve, some tangible steps for learning about this skill or this task that you're trying to accomplish. The other result, if you do this, is every day you'll have something to point to, and you'll be able to say, hey, it's not finished, but I did this, and that part is finished. So put yourself in the mindset of the guy that produces the 12 table legs and have something that you can point to and say, it's done, and mean it. It's done. I'm not going to touch it again. It's done. And I think that's the way to attack this feeling that is really demotivational. This feeling of, well, I spent 8 hours doing something, but I don't have anything to show for it, and create things to show for it. And that's the value of the completionist mindset. Of course, as I said a couple of times throughout this podcast episode, I'd love to hear from you on this topic or any of the others, really. If you'd like to send me an email, I'd love to get it. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. If you want to do that, please do add, hey, I listened to the podcast. And that way I'll be able to sort you out from the marketers. And so would love to have that connection and have a broader conversation about this. I enjoy doing what I do with the podcast, but it is kind of one way. And so I'd love to get some feedback, some questions, all those kinds of ideas. And LinkedIn is a good way to do that. If you're not aware, if you're listening to the podcast and you're not aware, one of the things that I'm currently doing is I'm posting the topic of this week's podcast before I record it so that I can get some feedback and some input on that. So if you're a podcast listener, I'd love for you to follow me on LinkedIn so that you have the best chance of seeing those conversations as they build, because I want to produce value in your world, and I want to answer questions and discuss topics that are going to be useful to you. So with that in mind, go out there and start getting the completionist mindset, and I think it'll help you do busy right. I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do busy right.